Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russell Wald. I'm the executive director here at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, and we're thrilled that you can be here. At HAI, our mission is to convene diverse voices from academia, industry, government, and civil society to engage in critical conversations about the development of artificial intelligence. We aim to explore not only the technological advancements, but also the societal, ethical, and governance implications of AI. Today, we are pleased to welcome Karen Hao, an award-winning journalist whose work has significantly shaped public understanding of AI. From her reporting at the MIT Technology Review, Wall Street Journal, and The Atlantic to her new book, Empire of AI, Karen offers a deeply reported narrative that examines the rise of OpenAI and the broader dynamics of the AI industry. Empire of AI details the complexities of AI development, highlighting the interplay between innovation, storytelling, and power structures. Through extensive interviews and research, Karen sheds light on the global impact of AI, including labor practices and environmental considerations. She prompts us to reflect on the paths we choose in advancing this technology. Moderating today's discussion is HAI Senior Manager for Research Communities, Patrick Hynes. He will guide us through an exploration of these themes and more. Thank you, everyone, and please help me welcome Karen and Patrick.
Awesome. Well, first, Karen, there is some news this morning that you are now a New York Times bestselling author.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Congrats. What is that like?
It's been overwhelming. Like I mean, when you work on a book, it's so isolating. You're just sitting in your room at your desk by yourself, without any colleagues to bounce ideas off of. And so in my mind, I really hoped and imagined that my book would start a conversation and be a platform for other people to build on, but you never know how it's going to be received in the world. And it's just been such an honor, and I'm so grateful that people are really resonating with the book and making it their own.
Yeah. You know, you're talking about the time that you spent on the book. I'd love to talk a little bit more about your story as a journalist, because one of the things that I took away while reading the book is there's this through line of the importance of storytelling, the importance of communication, both within an organization and also how we communicate with others about the work that we're doing. And then part of that, I think, is also the role of journalism and the role of journalism in the discussion of advances in AI. So I'd love for you to take a step back and share a bit more, because you started in the technology industry and moved over to journalism.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a bit more about your journey from moving from industry into journalism, and also along with that, how covering AI has changed over the past 7 or 8 years that you've been doing this.
That's a great question. So my background, I studied mechanical engineering at MIT, and I never thought I was going to be a journalist. That was not a plan that I had. I thought I was going to work in the tech industry for my whole career, and I did what a lot of my classmates and friends did, which is we all then moved from Boston to SF and joined startups and joined tech companies, and that was going to be our life. And at the time, the reason why I chose engineering was I was really interested in developing technology as a tool for social change. And the cause that I really cared about back then, that I still care about deeply today, is sustainability, and how do we actually prevent the impending climate crisis that we're now in. And I thought, if we could just build better products that shape people's behaviors, like maybe that's the right way to create that social change. And in the first year that I worked in tech, I only lasted a year working in tech, I realized that it's really, really hard to develop technologies tackling problems that don't make money. Sustainability it's not a money-making endeavor. I mean, you can try, and there are many people that are now trying to turn it into more of like a viable business, but when it becomes a viable business, I think it's actually too late. Like we should have started developing those technologies a lot earlier, before there was even commercial potential around these types of things. And so it really made me confront this idea of, do I actually want to stay in the tech industry and stay in Silicon Valley if ultimately the problems that I want to tackle aren't ones that are going to make money? And that's what led me to think, well, maybe I should change my tool of choice from building technology to writing for social change. And that's how I naively hit upon the idea of maybe I should be a journalist. I've never done that before, but sure, why not? And so I went into the journalism industry thinking, okay, now I really want to tell stories that that try to create markets and incentives for that technology development, or for just facilitating more of all of the actions, different types of actions that we need for sustainability. So originally, I actually conceived of myself as an environmental reporter. But I made this shift in 2016 as a lot of news outlets were starting to grapple with the idea that technology platforms are things that shape society and that can shape politics, and that they needed to start scrutinizing the impact of tech in that way more. And so I initially thought that I was being pigeonholed into being a tech reporter because of my background, but then I realized that it was an amazing opportunity for me to continue telling stories and documenting the ways that technology is developed, the culture under which technology is developed, the financial systems, as well as the way that that technology then impacts everyone around the world. Yeah. And when I started covering AI, which was in 2018, I originally started from a more technical perspective, because that's what I knew, and I was really interested in reading the research and just unpacking in articles, like, how do I translate this more dense technical knowledge into something that's publicly accessible so people understand all of the really cool research techniques that are coming out of academic and corporate labs. But very quickly, I realized that's only a small part of the story. And really, if we want to be thinking more broadly about technology's role, I have to start telling stories about people, the people that make the technology and the people that are affected by the technology. And so I started shifting my work more and more from 2018, from more research explainers, technical explainers, to this on-the-ground reporting and interviews with executives, interviews with people all around the world that are affected. And I've seen generally that arc with other AI reporting and tech reporting in general is, like, as the public has become more and more aware that technologies are not neutral, that there are values embedded in these systems, and it does matter who they come from and what those people's worldviews are. I have seen more and more of that type of journalism as well, but we need more of it. And part of what I hope to do with my book is to continue bringing that message home, that technology isn't neutral, technology isn't inevitable. There are actually choices that shape these things, and therefore everyone has a role in making those choices in the future.
Yeah. Let's dive into this a little bit more, because I'd love to get your perspective. If you had a magic wand, like, what would it look like for journalism to cover AI right now? And just some additional context, you see major newspapers still have a tech-specific section.
Yeah.
The way in which your book begins to frame the companies at the center of this, is that the right place for this now? Like, yeah. How can journalism, sort of move at the same speed as the technology in order to tell stories that I think are, relatable, and also that can allow for the broader public to get this type of understanding of both the tech and the people behind it too?
The first thing that I would do if I had the magic wand is just increase the number of journalists that are covering this all around the world. For people that don't follow the media industry and the news that's happening all the time within our space, the media industry is very rapidly crumbling. I don't want to be pessimistic about it, but that is the reality. Like, I think pretty much every week I see headlines of my fellow journalists being laid off at organizations. The Wall Street Journal laid off their tech reporters recently. The Information laid off a bunch of tech reporters. The Business Insider literally just today announced that they were laying off 20% of their staff. Like, this is like it's a pretty dire situation. Like, when I joined the industry, people were warning me, don't do it because it's falling apart. But like, now I feel like it's like truly falling apart. And so that would be the first thing that I fix the model of the business model for journalism so that there are way more people that are doing this work and they're well-resourced to do the work. The second thing is I would really love to see more global stories, because I think a lot of AI coverage is still very, very US-centric right now, and most journalists writing stories about tech and about AI are asked to live in San Francisco. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You want to be engaging regularly with people at the center of creating this technology, but I do think it narrows the aperture of understanding the technology's impact globally. And really, like, I've always believed that the best way to understand whether technology is actually bringing benefit to all of humanity, as OpenAI likes to say, that you actually need to go to the places that are least like Silicon Valley to understand how the assumptions that might have been made in the epicenter of power, how they actually fall apart when you get to the edges of what I call the AI empire. And so, yeah, so I think that would be the second one. And then the third one is just really understanding, as I alluded to just now, that this is ultimately a story about power. And what I run a journalism training program with the Pulitzer Center called AI Spotlight Series, where over the last year and a half and going on into it's a 2-year program, we've trained thousands of journalists around the world to cover AI. And we always say, this is ultimately an AI accountability story, because these are companies that are accruing an enormous amount of not just economic power, but also political power. And we need, like, journalists have always been a really critical function for holding power to account. And we need to understand that this is more urgent than ever before with these companies. And so we really focus on that lens for understanding the best way to help readers, help the general public, help policymakers really understand what's happening.
Yeah. I'd love to talk a bit more about the stories that don't necessarily get told or are not the headlines, because one of the things is folks, if they haven't read the book, we have copies as noted. One of the things that I really appreciated and thought was exceptional was the way in which you naturally incorporated perspectives from the global south into the narrative. And so I was curious about how you made the decision to incorporate those, why you felt like it fits how you understood that it fits seamlessly into the broader structure. And finally, how do we collectively follow the lead that you've set in terms of bringing those stories to the fore? How do we bring more stories up? I think about it from the lens that I sit in. How do we bring greater attention to some of the exceptional work that we hear about in the field that I hear about, but that may not get out there more broadly? And so I really want to hear more about that, because that part of the book was just wonderful.
Yeah, so one of the promises that I made to myself when I set out to do this book was I really, really didn't want to do a corporate book that just stays in San Francisco for all the aforementioned reasons. Like, I really wanted to show that this is a global story, this technology has global impact, and that you do not see how the technology can truly, really badly harm people and have it fall apart unless you go to places where there are vulnerable communities where they do not have, the strong political institutions or economic institutions that exist here. And so I knew that in order to write the book, I had to do a lot of travel. So the book goes to Kenya, it goes to Chile, Uruguay. It also draws on reporting that I did in South Africa and Colombia. And I didn't get a chance to physically go to New Zealand, but it also talks about people that I interviewed remotely in New Zealand and their experiences. And it's because ultimately the book makes this central argument that empire of AI, it's a nod to this argument that these companies like OpenAI, we need to actually understand them as new forms of empire. And the reason is, as I mentioned before, it's not just economic power that they're accumulating, it's also political power that they're accumulating. And the empires of AI, as I call them today, have all of the same characteristics as empires of old, the centuries-long history of European colonialism. And those characteristics are They lay claim to resources that are not their own, but they reinterpret rules to suggest that it was always their own. So data scraped from the internet, companies always say, well, it's in the public domain, it's totally ours. But at the end of the day, people who put that data up there, they did not have informed consent in understanding that it could be eventually scraped for training these technologies, and that these technologies could then potentially impact their economic opportunities. The empires also exploit a lot of labor around the world. So, of course, empires of old did that by literally not paying that labor. Empires of AI, they contract workers in the global south that do not have good working conditions by any measure of the word good. They're paid $2 an hour. They're doing work that is itself extremely harmful. Like they might be doing content moderation that's psychologically traumatizing. And also the development of these technologies are fundamentally being developed as labor automating technologies, because OpenAI's definition of AGI is highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work. Like, what do we think is going to be the logical conclusion of that specific definition of AGI? Empires also have a monopoly on knowledge production. So one of the things that has happened in the last decade with the AI industry is because these companies are so rich and well-resourced, they can easily pay these researchers $1 million compensation packages. And of course, universities can't really compete. And so we've seen a dramatic shift of the top research talent in the world going from university labs to corporate labs. And the AI research that's produced today, much of it is filtered through the lens of what is best for these companies, and there's censorship to suppress research that makes the companies look bad. And so it's filtered through the lens of the empire, like what fortifies the empire instead of weakening the empire. And then the last characteristic is empires always have a narrative that there is this aggressive competition between evil empires and good empires. And the justification for why the good empire, even need to be an empire and do all this resource extraction, all this labor exploitation, is because they need to be strong enough to counter the evil empire. And I write in my book about how OpenAI shifted who the evil empire was, throughout its company history, depending on what was most convenient at that time. But in their conception of being a good empire, they then also have a civilizing mission, which is we are actually doing all of this for the benefit of all of humanity. That was the rhetoric that they literally used back then when, a lot of empires were spreading Christianity around the world and saying, we are the reason you will get to go to heaven instead of go to hell. And today we even have these organizations using that kind of religious rhetoric and talking about AGI will either bring humanity to heaven or bring humanity to hell. And it is our job to roll it out and make sure that it's heaven and not hell. And so, because I really wanted to highlight the fact that we are in this empire moment, I wanted to go to places in the global south to show the logic of the empire, because it's only then that you really start to see that kind of logic. And what I mean is, like, in Kenya, I met with workers that were contracted by OpenAI. And at the time when they were contracted, OpenAI was moving from more research orientation to starting to commercialize. And they were thinking about what happens when we put text generation models into the hands of millions of users. Like, obviously, Microsoft had a very infamous scandal back in the day with their chatbot Tay, where they did that, and then Tay started spewing all kinds of hateful, abusive, racist speech, and it was a huge PR crisis for Microsoft. And so OpenAI thought, we don't want to do that. We need to build a content moderation filter that will wrap around these models and prevent these models from actually landing us in hot water. And so they contracted these Kenyan workers to create that content moderation filter, which meant that these Kenyan workers were reading day in and day out reams of the worst text on the internet, as well as AI-generated text, where OpenAI was prompting models to imagine the worst text on the internet and asking them to annotate in detail a taxonomy of, is this violent content? Is this graphic violent content? Is this extremely graphic violent content? Is this sexual content? Does it involve abuse? Does it involve abuse of children? And these workers they completely broke down. They lost their mental health, their sanity, and their families and their communities were affected as well because people depend on them. So I write about this one man, Mo Fadokinye, who I met, who, as he did this work, his personality changed so dramatically that his wife got really scared because she didn't know what's going on. He felt too ashamed to tell her that his job was reading sex content all day. He did not know how to explain that to her. And one day she asks him, I would like fish for dinner. He goes out, buys 3 fish, one for him, one for her, one for her daughter from a different relationship that he also loved and called his baby girl. And by the time he got back home, all of their stuff was gone. And she just sent him a text, I don't know who the man that you've become. I'm not coming back. And that's when you see the logic of empire, because there's no reason why we should be okay with the development of these technologies having that kind of effect, unless you believe in the ideology that there are people who are naturally endowed or have a God-given right to be superior, and they get to subjugate people who are born inferior. And that is ultimately the philosophy of what empires are.
Mm-hmm. Are there anyone else that is out there telling these stories? I guess and I'll just add on to that because those feel absent in the narrative. Yeah. But I also think that we don't place enough attention as well on those stories that showcase the potential. When I was reading your book, I, out of curiosity, just did a quick search for the number of stories from last year's chemistry Nobel, which is driven by advances in AI. And it got a blip on the radar. And so a takeaway from that is we're not only missing these stories of the broader world and in particular of the global South, but we're also not capturing
like the good case studies.
So what does that look like? How do we also get to a point where those are actually breaking through as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, like the reason why we're not seeing a lot of these stories in either direction is because there's so few journalists that are covering this. Yeah. And it can be really, really hard.
That's the root cause.
Yeah, and it can be really, really hard for, because I've been doing this training program with thousands of journalists, like they do not know where to go to even learn about this information because the space is so noisy now that one of the most common questions that I get asked in these trainings is, how do we tell who's the real experts? Because there are so many people that are fashioning themselves as AI experts now. Yeah. And they're also on a job. They're under an extraordinary amount of pressure. Like the industry is collapsing around them. They're trying to retain, they're trying to not to be laid off, to meet their deadlines. And like under all of this, they're trying to sort through all of like the wheat from the chaff and try and learn an entirely new subject. So I think like the role that, researchers and institutions like Stanford High can do is put out materials that really break down in super digestible form. Like, how does this technology work? What are some of the really great case studies? Like putting out the fact that the chemistry Nobel, like walking people through how it is actually related to AI. Yeah. So that like there are resources out there for the journalists who are also just as lay as the average reader, who then have to like run really fast to try and become an expert in this thing so that they can then say it to the lay reader in words that are understandable. So so I think that is just there just needs to be more capacity and more research, and as much as possible as people who are the experts can meet journalists and meet the public where they are, is I think the most helpful thing.
Yeah. This makes me, I want to circle back to that, you mentioned leaving SF because it can be a bit of a bubble, but I'm also thinking about 2 parts of this. One, there's probably value for journalists being close to
absolutely
the hub, and there are some folks I think that do better at that than others. So I suppose part one is the trade-offs between being close to it and being sort of far away. I guess I'm also thinking about like the research that's emerging here, that there's a value as well, whether that's from academic research or industry side, of having sort of a cluster of folks that are highly skilled in these fields, and having that level of talent concentrated has a lot of value too. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that balancing act, like from both as a journalist, but also as sort of a means of knowledge generation and having like clusters of really thoughtful people within a field in one place.
Yeah, it's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, this has been a tension throughout my career because I have almost exclusively covered the tech industry, not in SF. So I first was in New York, and then I was in Boston, and now I live in Hong Kong. And for me, it's been really rewarding to not be in SF because it allows me to stay connected to the global perspective, and to just remember that there are, there's still people out there, like just every time I travel, I always will ask random people like, oh, have you heard of OpenAI? Have you heard of ChatGPT? And I still encounter people who haven't. And like, it's a good reminder that there are people that, they haven't even heard of the technology. They still don't really understand what's going on. But you're right that it is also really advantageous from another angle to be in the thick of it. Like I have colleagues who have lived here for a long time. They get tons of tips just going to parties. I don't I don't really get to do that. I mean, I swing by and will try to do that on my short trips, but it is a different trade-off. And I think the challenge for being within the thick of it is that you can start to lose touch with how most people in the world are talking about this, and you can start like when I spend too much time talking with people that are deeply knowledgeable about AI, like my vocabulary starts to change. I start using a lot more technical terminology. I start to use a lot more specific ways of talking about these things that are only unique to San Francisco and the Bay Area. And then I'll be talking to someone outside and they'll be like, sorry, what are you saying? And then it's a good reminder of, oh, right, like these are not terms that are actually in the broader lexicon. And
the trick is just don't have friends that work in tech.
Yeah, and so it is a balancing act, and I think it's true of researchers as well. Like obviously, you want to be constantly in conversation with other researchers. You want to be exchanging ideas and keeping up with the most cutting edge, exciting work that's happening, and also keeping in touch with all the fast moving developments that are happening within these companies. But also, like if you do live in the center. Try to, as much as possible, like take opportunities that take you away, that help you engage with people that are not in that environment, that might be afraid of the things that you're doing. Like have a dialogue with them. I mean, that's the thing that I love about my job is that that's what I get to do for a living. Like I get to go to a Kenyan worker's home and sit with him in his living room for hours and listen, just listen to what he has to say about this thing. And those are always the most educational, transformative moments for me, is actually interfacing with people that do not have, that just are not in any remote sense in that center of power, that feel that the agency to shape these technologies, that know the vocabulary, and then grapple with like, how do I now write stories that will help more people feel that they do actually have that agency.
Yeah. I want to talk about I'll stay on with storytelling because the storyteller in chief in the story is Sam Altman, who that appears to be his superpower. I want to get into how he does that, and also like what we can take away, because I view that as an incredible positive. That ability to really capture minds through stories is so exceptionally important to the rise of the company and the technology, and frankly, his ability to bring in resources and capital.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about this more from the lens of where we sit now. It's like, how can we all get better at telling those stories? And just from your vantage point as an exceptional storyteller yourself, like I want to be able to take away things that will allow us to be better at telling those stories that don't get into publications, or that highlight in lay speak why some of this work is so exceptional. What are those lessons we can take away from Sam Altman's capacity as a storyteller that allows us to then move towards having that kind of influence and knowledge generation towards the benefits of this technology?
Yeah, I do want to distinguish between like Sam Altman storytelling and journalistic storytelling, in the sense
Yes, that'd be awesome.
that Altman is really good at is painting theoretical visions of the future that are not necessarily grounded in reality. And he has, as I learned through the process of reporting my book, he has a loose relationship with the truth. So he's able to come into a room with someone and persuade them to want to be part of a certain vision that he paints of the future, because he's able to say whatever is needed that he thinks that they need to hear. And he's really good at understanding what people need to hear. And journalistic storytelling is about telling the facts, telling the reality. You know, part of the reason, part of my mission with the book was so much AI discourse is not grounded in reality. It's completely within the realm of the theoretical in the public discussion. It's people just conceiving, like, maybe AI will bring us utopia, maybe AI could kill us all.
Right.
And neither of those are narratives that are based in evidence, you know? And so I wanted to tell, like, this is what's happening right now as AI is interfacing with society. And that should be the evidence that tells us more than anything what could happen next, and therefore, like, what we should be doing now to make sure what happens next is better. And so that is the type of storytelling that I hope other people can engage in, is telling the facts of the matter, not just the actual research that's happening, but also how, like, sometimes, like, my critique of researchers is when you are just thinking about the research and you're not necessarily thinking about how people then use a capability, there also becomes a disconnect, because you think, oh, it would be so amazing, like, we've now developed this capability and it will be amazing when people use it in XYZ way. But they lose touch with the fact that actually people are using it in ABC way, and therefore, like, the capability might actually be more negative than positive in the current reality of our society and how people naturally gravitate towards certain things.
Yeah.
Like, an example is, like, the rapid advancement in image generation and video generation right now. I mean, like, people have in their minds these beautiful case studies of how this could be really empowering. And then, like, when it interfaces with the world as it is, like, there's just a lot of deep fake pornography that's being generated, and that's harming, you know, women, children, and a lot of people around the world. So I think, like, that is, like, if you can tell stories that are actually connected with people's real experience, that's what becomes powerful. And I think that's why a lot of my story, I've been very privileged to be able to tell stories that do resonate with a large audience, because people see themselves reflected in what I am documenting in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. You just quickly touched on sort of like video generation.
Yeah.
Some of the ability with the storytelling I'm realizing is that it is much easier to latch on to, oh, that generated this block of text. I view that in a very sort of anthropomorphized kind of way, or like, hey, that generated a video or an image from just a quick prompt.
Yeah.
You think part of that, like, part of the appeal is due to the fact that it's much easier to just sort of it's like, oh man, I just turned that one line of text into video. Like, that is that easier for folks to capture than, say, some of the more, I don't know, more sophisticated stories that are required in other fields? Do you think that's part of the appeal or the allure?
I mean, yeah, I'm curious, like, what do you find more appealing and alluring about that?
Well, so I think the jump from typing in like one line of text to like a very clear image, to me, it's like it's sort of mind blowing immediately, right? Yeah. That's a lot easier than like trying to explain. I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that like.
Yeah, like
I mean, we'll go back to the Nobel example. It's like,
yeah, right.
Allow me like 15 minutes to go into that. It's.
Yeah, right? I mean, yes, yeah. So like, I think one of the key skills that like I developed as a journalist was remembering what the average person encounters, like what their experience is, and like relating something that feels really far away from their experience directly to something that they know. So most people are not going to win a Nobel Prize in their life, you know, and most people don't have a really deep understanding of chemistry. So if you want to convey why this particular breakthrough and the fact that it used AI is actually something anyone should care about, you have to then connect it to, and this will help create, I actually don't know what it was, but it was like, this will help create better drugs. And that is why this is an amazing thing. And like those drugs are going to then help you like tackle, help your parents get better access to healthcare. Like that is something that everyone connects to. Everyone at some point in their life worries about their loved ones aging and worries about whether or not they will have access to healthcare. So like that's how you have to relate something that feels far away to something that actually every single person experiences. And so that I think is the crux of telling stories that really resonate widely.
Yeah, I'm cracking half a grin because I'm thinking about ways in which we can bring this kind of storytelling to some of the work that we see every day here. And I'd love to spend some time on the epilogue because while we had 400 pages of like, oh man, I'm really in the mud here. The last part of the book, I came away almost, I was fired up. Yeah. And I'm a little bit more optimistic by nature, just in general. But the emphasis on the opportunity to, sort of drive, create sort of knowledge generation, to begin to try to bring in resources and to command a bit more influence. I'd love to talk about how you think about those three things and the strategy for those of us that want to support and facilitate not just knowledge generation, but the distribution thereof. And then to also leverage that as a means of bringing influence to projects and activities and institutions that are really driving towards maximizing the benefit of humanity of this work.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the strategy for attempting to do that? What are some of the steps along the way?
Yeah, so in the epilogue, I talk about, first of all, I mention that, I'm not critical of all of AI. I'm specifically critical of the version of AI that companies like OpenAI have introduced and now dominates a lot of people's attention around like what AI is. The average person does not understand that there are many different types of AI. They just think that it's like ChatGPT, generative AI, large language models, if at all, if even they get to, like that level of vocabulary. But people in the general public think that like AI advancements can only come now from like $500 billion investment in AI computing infrastructure. And this is, I think, a really dangerous, narrow conception of what AI can be. Of course, there's so many different types of AI technologies. There will be many more types that haven't yet been developed yet. And so the thing that I try to highlight in the epilogue is we need to continue remembering that there are actually a diversity of different AI approaches, and there are many different ways in which AI can actually benefit people, but this specific scaling at all costs approach to AI is one where the benefits are, I believe, very much being completely outweighed by the harms of its development. And we need to find more AI approaches where the harms are not there and we can actually just get the benefits on the other side. And so I talk about this idea of containing the empire, going back to the empire metaphor, where I really think we need to go back to a much more democratic form of governing AI technologies. And what I mean, like oftentimes when people think about that, they think, oh, the AI is already created and then we democratically govern like how it's deployed. No, I'm talking about democratically governing how it's created as well. And thinking about the whole supply chain of AI development, there's all of these different ingredients that go into the creation of AI. And there are all these different spaces where AI is then deployed. So there's the data, there's the supercomputers, there's the land, energy, the water, there's education, the education space, the healthcare space, the scientific discovery space. And all of these are areas where there needs to be public dialogue about what data actually gets to go into these models. Like people should, the average person feels that they have no more data privacy. They have no agency over whether or not their kids' photos are being taken, hoovered up, and trained in these models. Like, we cannot be in a world where people feel like they've completely lost control over their data. Also, like communities feeling like they don't have any ability to contain their utility prices, because these data centers are coming in and consuming their freshwater resources and consuming their energy. They cannot be in a world where they feel they have no ownership anymore over their, like their property value, their homes, like the noise within their community because of these data centers, or like how much they pay for their bills. So all of these need to be discussions where everyone who is affected at each stage of the development pipeline or the deployment stage get to actually voice how they want to see things shaped. And so ultimately, I think if we can get to a point, and we are already starting to see a lot of this, when artists and writers are suing these companies, like that is an assertion of, wait a minute, we don't actually agree with how you're defining what data is yours. This is our data, and we want to have this public discussion about that. And we are seeing teachers and students starting to debate, like, wait a minute, how should we actually deploy AI in classrooms? Are there certain ground rules around the deployment of this such that it actually enhances our critical thinking instead of us becoming overly reliant on it and then missing out on the true value of an education? If we have more of those discussions, like 100,000 times fold, I think we can get to a world where AI is broadly beneficial. And I guess to go back ultimately to your question of what ultimately institutions like Stanford and Stanford High can do, one of the things that we really, really, really need to contain the empire is, as I mentioned, a feature of empires is their monopoly on knowledge production. There's this an inability for public or policymakers now to consult with experts that are not financially conflicted with these empires, because they naturally gravitate now to, oh, let me just talk to OpenAI, let me just talk to Anthropic for what they think needs to happen. And Stanford is an institution that can provide that independent expertise and say, actually, here are all of the different ways that AI could be developed. Here's all of the exciting research that is happening that might not have anything to do with the commercial chatbots. And this is what we should be investing in. This is what we should be funding. These are different conceptions of what AI can be. And these are also the limitations of certain types of conceptions of AI that we don't actually want to perpetuate. And I think that is like more of that independent knowledge production outside, what I call outside of the empire, I think will really, really help facilitate just much better governance of this technology in the long term.
Yeah. Do you think, I'm curious what your thoughts are on sort of partnerships with industry then. I wanted to chat about that because I ultimately think there's value, especially in that knowledge exchange.
Yes.
And I'm curious your thoughts on how that can play a role in that process of creating a space in which there is real dialogue.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that it's important to have industry partnerships, but I think with I think a lot of your questions kind of revolve around like, do you partner? Do you live in the thick of it, or do you live outside of it? Like, do you partner or do you not? And ultimately, the answer is you have to do both. And the issue is not when you do one or the other; it's when you do only one or only the other. Like that's when you really start to like if all of Stanford was just funded by OpenAI, like that wouldn't work very well. But certainly having a balanced portfolio where you have industry partnerships and you have independent projects that are completely unrelated to industry, I think that's where you start to have a really good level of broad, diverse innovation. Yeah,
I like that balanced portfolio approach to sort of knowledge generation and distribution. That's great. I'm looking at time. Let's pause on our conversation because I'd love to make sure that we leave ample time for questions with the audience.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Patrick. The question I have is on the innovator's dilemma you mentioned. He thinks of doing it as an XYZ, but it will be put into ABC. Let's go back. The inventor invented the knife, but it is put into use by surgeon as well as the murderer, right? Only the law enforcement could control even till today, right? Why do, in your mind, inventor have to worry about it?
Because ultimately, why do we build technology and do science? I mean, it's to bring progress to humanity. And if ultimately that scientific and technological work is not actually bringing progress, that is fundamentally undermining the entire enterprise. So I think it is really, like, yes, every technology has benefits and harms, but we cannot use that as an excuse to then allow for any type of harm, because every technology also has a different landscape of benefits and harms. There are some technologies where there are many more benefits than harms, and there are other technologies where there are many more harms than benefits based on the reality of, society and just the human nature. And so those need to be observed and taken into consideration to ultimately continue helping to lead to that progress over time.
Thank you for coming and sharing. I look forward to reading the book too. Earlier this week, we had Joanna Smolinska here from EU policy, and you talked about containing the empire. Public policy with instruments for doing that. But we're kind of in maybe a horse race a little bit with China, their national security issues that are tied up with AI and things like that. And my takeaway from seeing Joanna the other day was they were struggling with that. They want the EU to catch up to the US, but they actually probably have the strongest policies that exist to date. So to me, it's very unlikely that the US or China will even, the pendulum will swing as far as what's happening in the EU. So how realistic is it, given all these things that are wrapped up with what's going on with AI, that you can contain the empire like you suggest? And if so, what is a more pragmatic type of policy that you do think could be instituted, maybe not with this administration, but maybe in 2029?
Yeah.
And so, because maybe there's a desire, like there's something that you really want, but what's realistic?
So I used to say that policy was a really important tool, and now, given, as you said, we're in a really interesting moment in time, I say don't wait on policy anymore, because it moves too slow anyway, and obviously the current administration is not really interested in regulating these technologies. I mean, there's the Republican tax bill that has just passed the House and is going up to the Senate has a clause in it that will put a ban on AI regulation at the state level for the next 10 years. So there's clear, like the US government has already signaled in multiple ways that it is not going to be taking leadership on figuring out what the right guardrails are for the development and deployment of these technologies. And so one of the stories that I highlight in my book is about this amazing activist group in Chile that they ended up fighting tooth and nail against the development of data centers within their community. Chile has a really interesting history in that it was under dictatorship for a really long time. And under that dictatorship, a lot of public goods were privatized, including water, fresh water. And it just so happens that due to an anomaly, there's one community in Chile, in the Santiago metropolitan region, where the fresh water still is public. And it just so happens that Google decided to place their data center in that specific neighborhood and they proposed to tap into that freshwater resource. And they proposed to use more than 1,000 times the amount of fresh water that community used. And when that activist community caught wind of that, they lit up and were like, no, what are we getting in return for hosting this data center? They were like, it's not that we don't want the data center, but you better come up with a really good, mutually beneficial agreement for why we need to host this data center. And they raised such a stink, like handing out flyers on sidewalks, knocking on neighborhood stores, that it eventually escalated all the way up to the Chilean government, and the Chilean government then brought Google, Microsoft, all the other company representatives and the activists together. They now have like a roundtable where they have to actually engage with the community residents that are actually hosting these data centers to talk to them about under what conditions and under what modifications can we actually reach some kind of mutually agreeable solution. And when I was saying contain the empire, I meant less so now waiting for top-down action and more this kind of bottoms-up action where people who own the different ingredients of the supply chain, people who collectively own the spaces in which these technologies are deployed, need to have that kind of spirit of saying, yes, but like, how can you make sure that it is ultimately good for us? And I think that is what is going to, in this era, lead us to much more effective, practical changes and shifts in the way that these technologies are developed. And I sometimes draw an analogy to the fashion industry. I mean, like the fashion industry also at a certain point in time had an enormous amount of environmental and labor harms. It's also still not perfect today, but it's gotten better because there was a lot of that bottoms up raising awareness of these issues, activists and consumers shifting their behaviors as well. And over time, because there was so much of a shift in that behavior, there were new markets that formed for ethical and sustainable fashion brands. And so I kind of think that we're in a moment right now where we have to do that. We have to have leadership at the bottom instead of wait for the leadership at the top. That is one of the hopes that I have for the book as well, is that it really motivates people to take the future in their own hands.
Awesome. I'm going to pull from a question online real quick. It goes back to that point you raised about the number of folks that are presenting as experts in AI. And I was even just thinking about it as you were responding to the previous question. There's a lot of noise. And so even in terms of like organizing principles, why do I want to see things change? It would be nice to be able to understand from and know who an expert is if I'm trying to sort of establish my own understanding of what it is that I would like to see change. So how do you sort of filter through expertise? That's kind of the question. How do we identify who really has expertise and can help to really shape our understanding of both the challenges and opportunities?
Like, how does Stanford identify the experts?
No, I'm thinking about like, I think the question was more as a person outside.
Okay,
also even like from your lens as a journalist, how do you go through and filter out those voices that are not necessarily experts? And also for us, how do we then identify who is actually bringing us to points that are salient to helping to establish sort of our own perspectives on these?
Yeah, I mean, it honestly comes down to just you and have to do a lot of research. I was really lucky in that I started covering this space before it got really noisy. So when I first started covering it, I was reading, 5 to 10 research papers a week and developing my own understanding of who are the people in the space that are doing really fascinating work. And then eventually they would introduce me to other people. And so now I have generally a good conception of both the technology, the research field, and also like people that I trust as key voices. But obviously for the average public, that is really, really hard. And so what I always tell like journalists who ask me this question too is like, when you hear someone talking, like look a little bit into their background, like first see what institutional affiliations they have, and if they're working for a company that is selling this technology, like think about what they're saying somehow inevitably leads you to the conclusion that therefore you should buy that company's product or service. Like that's a pretty good tip off that maybe you should seek another opinion. And also cross-check what people are saying against others. And ultimately, Stanford has a really great advantage in that it has a brand name. People will recognize the Stanford brand name. They will recognize that this is a place of expertise. And so I think from Stanford's perspective, also just continuing to put out high quality information in the world that then people can use as that cross-check reference, so that when they're trying to navigate through all this, they can at least have a signal that's clear and that they can use as a comparison point to then get rid of the noise.
Awesome. Okay, back there.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for doing this book. It's such a helpful framework for getting people engaged. And if we could go back to the influence of the money taking researchers to the companies from places like here. This whole idea of translation that you're calling a journalist to do, I think is just as much as a responsibility for people in business. So there was a minute when they started to hire a lot of talent to the corporate world that the academic culture seemed like it might influence the corporate culture. So if you don't share here, you're not building influence. That's not how it went. But can you talk maybe together about what other levers are there to take some of that power back and to reward sharing positive translations, because the money's not going the right way?
That's such a good question. Yeah, the money question is always really hard. This kind of goes back to a question that you asked earlier, which is like, how can we learn from the storytelling that Sam Altman does? Yeah. So one of the things that Altman identified quite early in his career is that people are motivated by mission. You know, like part of the reason why OpenAI was started as a nonprofit was because I think Altman strategically recognized if he wanted to build an AI lab at that time when Google already had a pretty big monopoly on a lot of the top AI talent, he couldn't compete on salaries. He had to compete on something else. And so he created this mission as the competitive advantage. And Ilya Sutskever, the former chief scientist there, that was actually the reason why Ilya moved from Google to OpenAI and took a huge pay cut, was this mission, this sense of purpose, where Altman said to him, effectively, I mean, not literally, but effectively, don't you want to do something big in your life? And I think that is maybe the way that institutions that are not as capitally resourced as these companies need to think, like, what is it ultimately? Yeah, like what is it that motivates people to move in this space? I mean, it isn't just money, right? Like it is serving a higher purpose. And I think like really articulating very clearly, like what is that higher purpose that Stanford High stands for? What is it, the thing that they will be able to work towards here that they would not be able to work towards in industry? That was something that Altman like really nailed. He was like, you can't do what we are setting out to do at OpenAI at Google. And that was what then created a lot of research talent to similarly take pay cuts as Ilya did. And so, yeah, I think it's just like really articulating what is that sense of purpose, what is that drive, and ultimately, I think that will help more people. And I think that is ultimately why, you know, like I talk with a lot of people who work in tech that they're tired of working in tech. They actually are searching for something else. Like I was just talking to someone who came to an old friend who came to my SF event yesterday, and he was like, yeah, I'm working for one of the empires and it's boring, you know, like, so they are searching for that thing. And I think there's an opening for the pendulum to swing back.
Yeah. You know, Karen and I were talking before we started the conversation here, and forgive me if this is just a half-baked idea, but I was thinking about, you know, the role that we can play versus how some of the industry actors are sort of set up. And if you think about it almost like a basketball team, I view our role as almost pass first, setting up everyone to be able to have the best shot and to be able to present their work in the way that makes them look the best and puts us in a position to move the field forward in such a way that it's moving the positives and everyone forward. I think the other side looks a little bit more like shoot first every time, like looking for your own shot. And that can lead to excellence, but it also comes at the expense of leaving out teammates and not driving the whole enterprise along. So maybe we're Magic Johnson and OpenAI is Kobe, you know, and those both can be exceptional in their own ways. But if I'm thinking about the role that we can play in this current context, it is making sure that exceptional research is being put in a position to be seen and by as many people as possible, and that can drive as much excitement to those folks who are doing exceptional work. And that's sort of the distinction I make is thinking first about setting up those who are doing the exceptional work in order to bring greater attention to it. Because we simply, while we are very well resourced, we need to make sure that we're using the other tools at our disposal. That capacity to sort of bring knowledge to a broader public as sort of the point at which we sort of bring more attention to those exciting things in the field.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you. I was curious about, you mentioned about journalists themselves and bringing in more journalists. I'm also curious about the platforms and the organizations behind the news, right? And what you see in terms of a future there for delivering journalistic material to everyone that is relatively unbiased, and where you're seeing success within that landscape at the moment, and how that might evolve over time. And I'm also thinking about social media, obviously, and how that has obviously impacted your profession.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask if you could clarify what you mean by platform, because I feel like it means so many different things today.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, I mean, we all use social media, and a lot of us now. I went to a talk actually at the Computer History Museum that talked a lot about how many people have moved towards social media to get them.
Yeah.
Having worked for a newspaper in the past as well, I was kind of curious because that doesn't exist anymore, right? So there's been huge changes in that landscape, and then what it means now to be a journalist and be an independent journalist. A lot of journalists I see that are independent seem to be on social media, on TikTok, or and carving out the stories there, which feel like I could, if you curate your feed, then you can hopefully get something reasonable. But that is obviously a change as well. So I was curious about what you're seeing there.
Yeah, I mean, it has definitely been an uphill battle and continuing to get quality information to readers, and it's gotten a lot worse now that all of our work is being like trained into ChatGPT, and then people are reading hallucinated versions of our journalism through generative AI tools. But I think the journalists that have been most successful in continuing to reach audiences are ones that are taking a portfolio approach, to go back to that word, where they are across all platforms, also doing like in-person events, constantly like trying to connect in different ways through different surface areas, rather than betting on like, there was a time when a lot of newsrooms bet just on Facebook, and then they all shut down when Facebook's algorithm changed. And so, yeah, like it's become a hustle for a lot of journalists. They're like on Substack. They also have a YouTube channel. They have a TikTok channel. They have like a Facebook, whatever, and they're just constantly shifting depending on what format is working for them. And a lot of them are trying to build direct audiences in that, like, subscribe to my newsletter or subscribe to my podcast so you get direct updates. So you're not actually just logging onto social media and seeing whatever content reaches you. They're trying to directly create that relationship so that it's delivered straight to their inbox. But it's an unresolved problem right now. Everyone within the media business is trying to figure out what is the next model for continuing to resource our work.
Right.
Hi, Karen. I think really thanks for this very great talk. So my name is Yijia. I'm currently a CS PhD student here. So actually, when you just mentioned like many people are leaving the academic to go to the company, maybe based on the money or the equity, I also have another question. Like, if you are doing the work at the academic environment, what is some way like you could allow your work to reach out to like a broader audience? Because I think like your analogy of this empire of AI, I think another problem is just not people kind of accumulating the talent, but also like they gather the way where you can share your voice, right? If you look at the current kind of public discourse about the AI, is also coming from like OpenAI or Anthropics. So I'm wondering, like, for research work, first, like, what are some channels like researchers could reach out to people besides posting papers? And second, like, in what kind of format people can better share our source or the voice?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one way, so journalists that cover the AI space typically go to a few places to try and really quickly ascertain like who they should talk to and what's happening. Conferences like NeurIPS, like ICML, iClear, all of those. Back in the day, I was like one of 6 journalists that would go to NeurIPS, and now it's like hundreds of, I don't know how many, but like there are lots of journalists that are like roaming around these conferences these days. So that's one way to like connect with more reporters and just share more about your work. Social media, like journalists still heavily rely on Twitter, Blue Sky, and increasingly LinkedIn now to see like what are the papers that are being that are getting more noise within the AI world, and also like work with your communications. Like I think Stanford High has a really great communications function. Like
We do. Yeah.
Signal
They're the best.
signal to them early that there you have research coming out, and think about, you know, in advance why you think it matters in the current news environment, what's happening in the world, like connect it to the things that are on people's minds, and get like package it a little bit for the communications team and say like, this is the work that's coming out. This is why I think it's important. This is why I think people need to know it now, and start that conversation early, because they are the ones that have the roster of all of the journalists who cover this topic that have shown interest in these in reading research papers before. And I think if you do a little bit of all of that, like you can get more of your work out in the public domain.
Yeah. No, right behind you. He's been waiting for a little while.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for coming. I was wondering if you'd be able to clarify your vision of like democratic governance for these AI systems, especially balancing against how can we prevent bad actors from getting access to the same systems that we would want academia to have access to. I remember I went to a conference where there was a big worry about in biosecurity of how a bad actor could use AI to make a bioweapon. So how can we bring it out in the open enough to be democratic, but not so out in the open that the wrong people get it?
Yeah, well, I mean, like the biosecurity one is a really interesting example, because like these models can only generate that stuff if they're trained on the bio data. So if we had more discussions, public discussions about, first of all, what data do we even use to train these models? I think that those upstream conversations need to happen first before we even get to the question then of should we be open sourcing certain models that might have those capabilities? Like we maybe actually at that point we decide, like collectively decide that we shouldn't even be training these models on the kind of data that would lead to novel bioweapons. You know what I mean? So like I think to me, like my vision is that we are having these conversations way earlier than just once the model is already trained, and then the question is, do we open source it or not? Like the question is first, like what kinds of AI technologies do we even want? And then like what kind of data should we be training it on? And then like how, like what should we be developing like extremely compute intensive or compute efficient AI models? And like once we get to that point, I think there will already have been significant conversations that will actually mitigate the downstream harms later. I don't know if that's helpful. Do you have a follow-up question? Yeah.
Wait for the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense for future models, but I'd ask, now that the models do exist, they do have this bio data in them, what do we do with them now that they're real and they're here?
Yeah, I mean, then it is about having the discussion about like whether those models should be opened or closed, and that in and of itself, because like the thing is, those conversations are currently only happening within these company walls, right? Like the companies themselves decide whether it's open or closed, but that's not to me, that's not democratic. Like democratic means you actually have the public discussion, and there need to be lots of different types of experts that weigh in. It's not just AI researchers, and it's not just biosecurity experts. It's also like human rights experts need to be part of that conversation. You know, people from completely different contexts that are not living in the US need to be part of that conversation. And there needs to be just a lot of different perspectives to talk about what are the benefits of open sourcing these models, what are the harms of open sourcing the models, and vice versa, what are the benefits and harms of keeping them closed? And then there should be a collective decision about that. I mean, that's what I mean by democratic, is there needs to be that collective discussion before a decision is made, rather than just having these companies decide one way or the other based on their own small circle of experts and also their financial incentives. Cool.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. You mentioned that the fashion industry is like a good case study for an industry that has progressively become more aware of ethical implications and has improved throughout the years. Do you have any other case studies in technology of industries that have sort of slowly migrated to a more like ethically minded approach of how tools are used, or maybe effective barriers?
That's a really good question, and the answer is no. I don't currently have one off the top of my head. Yeah, but I think because I mean, like we're talking digital. Like there might be case studies of non-digital technologies where this happened, but like obviously the game changes when it's a digital technology, and we are still in, I think, an era where there hasn't really been a lot of like we are still figuring out how to govern the digital technology. So.
Still early.
Yeah, like it's still early. But that's a great question. I'm gonna do some work myself to see if I can find an example. Thank you.
Got a few more minutes.
This is just me coming from a history major background. But you know, for centuries we've been having this debate about whether America itself is an empire, and you know, my personal opinion is that it is. And you know, with especially the defense sector, you kind of see a lot of these AI companies, the primes, you know, getting defense contracts with the U.S. government, and so it's almost like you have a empire serving an empire. Do you see the empire of AI, using this analogy, do you see it as kind of isolated within nationalities, like an American empire, a Chinese empire? Or do you see these AI companies as really their own thing? They're kind of just going for the highest bidder. And I know this is a big debate within, like, you know, even American foreign policy, whether, you know, companies like Google could serve, you know, our adversaries too. Do you see empires of AI as having a nationality?
This is a really good question. And I also think the US is an empire. I mean, the rhetoric that the Trump administration engages in now is like very, very clearly empire. So one historical analogy that I had started using is the British East India Company. And there's this amazing book called The Anarchy by historian William Dalrymple that talks about how the colonization of India by the British Empire originally started by a company. And it was a company that ruled over the Indian subcontinent for a couple hundred years before that company was then nationalized by the British Crown, and then India formally became a colony of the British Empire. But the history of how this happened was the British East India Company engaged in mutually beneficial trade agreements with India in the beginning. And then they gained a lot of economic power. And then they gained a lot of political power. And then they became the apex predator in the Indian subcontinent. And they were able to do whatever they wanted and start waging war, collecting taxes, subjugating this population without any consequence to themselves. There was no watchdog anymore to stop it. And that's when it evolved into an imperial power. So it was its own empire. And then eventually the state turned it into an asset of the British Empire. And we are seeing, I think, in this moment, Silicon Valley and the US government both entering their empire era. I mean, you know, some people have said, as you said, the US has been in its empire era for a really long time, but certainly I think there are fewer people arguing now that the US government has entered its empire era, and each one is trying to use the other as an asset to their empire building ambitions. And some of the rhetoric that you see coming out of these companies now, they do say that they don't think democracy works anymore. They don't think it makes sense. And so they're driving towards a world where they subsume the state, and the state is driving towards a world where they're trying to utilize Silicon Valley as a state building asset for as long as possible, and then nationalize these companies the way that the British Crown nationalized the British East India Company. And so both of them are kind of in this really, what I see as a fragile alignment right now, where they see kind of mutual benefit in perpetuating one another and their empire building. But at some point, I think there's going to be a collapse in this, or a clash, where one is going to try and overtake the other. And whichever scenario happens, like both of these are bad, like in both of these worlds, there's a perpetuation of empire and us returning to an age of empire, and democracy is weakened and potentially doesn't survive. And so that is, like, I guess to your question, like we absolutely, there are two empires, one that's a nation state empire and one that's like a corporate empire, and they're both ultimately trying to continue a world of empire. They're both trying to move away from democracy.
So we need to find and empower more journalists to be able to tell richer and better stories. I think that's
And citizen
and
journalists
citizen
and
journalists.
research journalists.
Yes, we need to identify those mechanisms through which we can bring attention to the parts of the field that are actually providing broad benefit to humanity. I'm trying to start to put together a list of ways that we can move into a post-empire era in which we're highlighting and bringing to the fore those things that are most valuable about this tech. And so I'm just thinking about some of the lessons. And we also need to be better at telling the story of those things, and also telling the story of the things that are most challenging. It's both the positives and the actual like barriers to making this a technology that's of value for everyone. And so I'm just trying to like really sort of articulate those ways we get there.
And I think one thing that would be amazing is if Stanford showed leadership in also making this technology a participatory development process. There's already some amazing research happening around participatory development. Like, how do we actually create more spaces for people to weigh in on these issues? And I think that is something that Stanford could absolutely take up as a challenge. Like, how do we innovate, not just on the technology, but on mechanisms of governance that allow everyone in the world to have a say?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that based on time, that's probably a good place for us to end. Karen, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.